Hello and welcome back to This Week in Enterprise Tech. I'm Hyoun Park from Amalgam Insights, joined as always by Charlie Araujo from the DX Institute. So it's been an interesting week out in the tech world. Both of us have been on the road. There have been some interesting numbers popping up from a macro perspective. And as always, there's AI announcements that have been made that are relevant to the world of enterprise tech. But the first thing I wanted to start out with is not a solely AI related topic, but the fact that cloud spend is back. Synergy Research came out with Q1 numbers stating that the cloud infrastructure market has grown 21% year over year last quarter, which is the fastest that cloud has grown in about 6 or 7 quarters, a year and a half. So the doldrums of the past year and a half, where things have only grown 12, 13, 14%, are gone for right now. The wallets are opening up again. And we've talked about this a little bit, but it looks like cloud spend and cloud FinOps have the need for them have not quite disappeared just yet.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. So we talked about this last week because Microsoft reported their numbers and they were up, and everyone was sort of attributing them to AI. And in this, this last round also being sort of attributed to AI. We have news about AWS also showing positive numbers and that being attributed to AI. What I'm curious about it, however, is I wonder if we're connecting dots that don't exist. Because again, everywhere I talk to folks, there's a lot of exploration, but nothing that would actually move the needle, not by this much, right? So this halo effect that people are talking about, if it's affecting all the major cloud providers, then is it really a halo? Is it really anything that it's, because the news last week was sort of this idea that because Microsoft made these big bets and that they went early, that it was causing people to shift spend to them because they wanted to be there. But now we're seeing that everyone is really that we're seeing the entire industry growing. So I don't know if this is in fact something broader, that there is this, we're seeing a normal cycle. It's a massive amount of spend during the pandemic. And then we saw this sort of fall off as the people sort of had to digest that. And now we're just seeing the normal swing of the market. And it really has nothing to do with all of these moves around AI. And right now, if I had to bet, that's actually what I'm betting, that this is just a normal business cycle, that the reality is enterprise IT, as has been the case for the last 20 years, continues to be a strategic investment that has just been growing year over year pretty much ever. And that the pandemic caused a little bit of a blip in that. And that the AI stuff is almost more of, I don't want to say distraction, because as we talked about, I think it's an important thing. But I don't know that it's what's really driving this. I think that the march to cloud is just something that is going to continue. And we're just seeing overall spend, the overall importance of it. So right now, that was my read on this news. But I'm curious your take.
Yeah, I actually agree. I love AI. My firm's named AI, but I do feel like AI is a bit of a red herring here, because just thinking about cloud infrastructure growing from, call it 62 billion to 75 billion. I'm not saying that's exactly the right numbers, but somewhere along those lines over the past year, on a quarterly basis. So that $13 billion in spend, is that all AI? Are you telling me that all these companies are now dumping millions of dollars of cloud spend directly into AI? I'm sure there's a few companies that are. There's always your 2%, 3% who are those market-facing experimenters who will try anything once. But for the vast majority of IT departments out there, I have to think that a lot of this is just projects that have been put off. Your standard applications, digital transformation, cloud migration, all this stuff that is honestly not super exciting, but has been taking up a lot of work. When you look at the standard software providers, call it the Informaticas, the Tableaus, the SAPs of the world, they're working like crazy right now, just pushing people from on-prem to cloud. That's happening right now in 2024 because enterprise applications are complicated. And I think that is really what's happening here.
Well, and I think we have to remember, right? I mean, I've been talking to a bunch of execs recently, and the vast majority of spend is has been, probably always will be, on bread and butter type functions, right? And
Mhm.
particularly in the so I think we often in enterprise tech make this big broad sweep when we talk about it, but there's really at least two classes. There's the really really big companies who are going to act much like tech companies, right? The largest whatever 100 companies in the world or so. These guys have a massive amount of spend. Their IT organizations or their tech organizations are typically larger than entire other companies, et cetera, right? And then you have
Mhm.
everyone else, which includes Fortune 500 companies, right? But this large, what I call the small to medium sized enterprise, often in hundreds of millions and billions of dollars in revenue. But these organizations, these CIOs, when you talk to them, their attitude is they're not doing a ton of development, or that development is occurring in other platforms like ServiceNow or Salesforce.
Mhm.
They're a SaaS first play. And so what is I think is interesting is that march is continuing. And of course, all those SaaS players that they're buying services from, what are they doing? They're buying cloud services because that's how they're supporting it. And, the
Mhm.
biggest ones like the Zohos of the world and a few others, we've seen this trend, are starting to actually build their own data centers again. But for the most part, those SaaS plays are all running on these cloud services. So I think this continued march, as people are just sort of doing their bread and butter business, is driving this continual shift. It may not be direct enterprise spend, but that this whole shift is driving this continued march to cloud. Because the reality is, well, many organizations may not, that we're seeing repatriation of some of these cloud workloads where they realized in a native form it didn't make sense to run them in the cloud. And so they're maybe moving back to on-prem, but they're also then moving those workloads and looking for these SaaS solutions, which indirectly is leading to cloud growth. So I think that we're going to just continue to see this sort of bread and butter motion, and that's just still going to keep supporting the cloud providers.
Yeah, and just on a related note, with cloud spend, Amazon came out with its Q1 earnings numbers, and they're now up to $100 billion annual run rate. So fantastic job for them. But I did note that they said they did 25 billion in revenue with 9.6 billion in income. That's a hot big margin. That to me, that means they're selling a lot of stuff that is high margin stuff that has some room for cost cutting right now. So for all those companies out there that did FinOps once or some sort of audit and think that they cleaned up their cloud environments and they're all clean and ready to go, looks like there's been a lot of recent spend that now needs to be cleaned up again. So just be careful there. This is the time to not just sit on your laurels and say, "Hey, we cut those cloud costs once in 2021, and we did such a great job." And great job us. This is an
Well,
ongoing battle.
and I think that goes back to this whole thing that I personally, I mean, we're what, I think this is week 12 of this, and we probably spent 70% of our 70% of our time talking about generative AI and AI in general. And I think it's, I don't want to say it's a disservice. I mean, look, we're following the news, we're talking about what people are
Mhm.
talking about. But I think we can't ignore the fact that the bread and butter, as we just talked about, is really the stuff that consumes most of the day-to-day life. And what's interesting is you and I were both at events last week that were really focused. I mean, there were obviously, I presume on your side and on my side as well, there's lots of AI, but the
Mhm.
core was bread and butter. So maybe we should talk a little bit about the more practical parts of it that are still happening.
Yes. So we were both out last week. I was at Tableau Conference, obviously an analytics company, analytics market leader that wanted to talk about AI all the time as part of their new capabilities and their bread and butter and their platform. But what I actually found interesting is that obviously you can't get away from Tableau in your data environment. Every large enterprise has at least one Tableau seat, and it is a favorite for data analysts around the world. They have a great community. Their technical keynotes are much like Apple keynotes, where the fanboys and fangirls will cheer over every single feature that comes out. And it's fantastic. They love the product, obviously, but Tableau also realizes that they need to expand beyond the data analyst, that there's this 75% of the employee base that honestly doesn't want to be data analysts and doesn't have time to be data analysts and doesn't have time to capture these 1,000 SaaS apps that are all around the company and to standardize that data schema so that they can do analytics intelligently. All of that is stuff that executives don't have time to do. Line of business workers don't have time to do. Operational workers just don't have time to do. So Tableau is working on their story on how to focus on the rest of those people, yes, with generative AI, but in a way that is actually conceptually and contextually relevant to those workers. So Tableau has that end user story that they're working on, as well as a partnership story that is now really centered on Databricks and Microsoft. It used to be that Tableau focused a lot more on working with more focused data players such as Alteryx or Informatica, important players in the software space, but very much focused on data management and data integration. And now they are actually looking at the big, massive data clouds and hyperscalers. And of course, they have their Amazon and Google announcements as well, but not quite as much as I would have expected, considering that Amazon CEO was formerly Tableau CEO. You would have thought there'd be a little bit of a closer partnership there, but it hasn't quite worked out yet. But even so, it was interesting to see that Tableau is working on a more holistic vision of how to work with data rather than simply empowering the data analyst and impressing people with their support of Google fonts, or now having red in 13 different versions or whatever excites data analysts and data report writers.
Well, so a couple of questions. I mean, one is, I think that this is, we talked a couple of weeks ago about Zendesk and their application of AI in a more pragmatic way. I think the news out of Tableau is very similar to this, right? This is less the big, big exciting approaches to AI and much more pragmatic uses. The things that I think ultimately are going to be where, as we go through the famous hype cycle, that we're going to see more, right? It's not as flashy, not as sexy, but it's more important. It's more usable from a day-to-day basis. And so I think that's positive. What I'm curious from your perspective before we move on from this topic is, the Salesforce acquisition was a while back, and it's normally about the time where we start seeing things either really click or really start falling apart. I mean, what's your read if you're a Tableau customer? Is this working out in your mind, or are there warning signs?
It's interesting in that, so the acquisition was about 5 years ago, but since then, it's been a little bit rocky from an operational perspective, partially because obviously COVID. So a year after the acquisition, they had COVID happen. And then since then, they've seen most of their founding executives leave. Not all of them, but many of them. So they've had to replace their CEO a couple of times. They've had to replace their chief product officer, Francois Agenstadt, who was a superstar in that organization, recently left about a year ago. He's been replaced by a guy named Souther Jones, who also has a very strong analytics background. So they had to fill in these gaps. And I feel like although they supported the data analyst community, they did it in a way that was kind of status quo, without a real vision of saying, here's what we are going to do next from a strategic perspective. And it's taken them basically the past 5 years to figure out how to get to a point where they have a vision that is anything more than simply improving the data analyst experience, which is honestly not that different from what every other business intelligence and analytics player out there claims to do. So it's been a challenging road for them, but I think that there's a renewed focus on the Tableau platform that is shown throughout the past year, now that their executive team has had across the board a year to settle in to their roles, and they've started to actually figure out what they need to do to grow the product. Because Tableau actually, as a business, has been pretty successful. It's been growing 20% a year. So they know how to sell the product over at Salesforce. They're comfortable with supporting the product. They know how to not mess it up. But now they have to figure out how to actually make it significantly better, just because that's where we all are in tech, either improve or die.
Yeah, and I think that's a great segue to the event I was at. So I was at something called HDI Support World, sort of the other end of the spectrum. If you're not familiar with it, HDI used to stand for the Help Desk Institute, and so this is a conference for people that run IT support desks, IT service desks. It's been around forever. It is frankly a shadow of its former self. The number I heard was there are about a total of 900 attendees. This event used to have 3,000 or 4,000. Going back a decade, I used to go to this event periodically, more focused on the service management side. But it was interesting seeing it. And you talk about, I'm not sure what you just said, innovate or die, or change or die. And I I think that as an industry, this whole space, support IT service management, has been struggling. And so I was actually talking to a good friend of mine who was also at the event. He's the head of AR for Freshworks by the name of Ken Gonzalez. He was a former Gartner analyst, and we were talking about it. And he said the words ITSM is dead, and that launched this entire sort of debate. And I come from the service management space, and so we had this whole debate. I ended up writing a blog post, sort of conveying our conversation. I said, ITSM as we know it is dead, which is a reference to the opening line of my first book 12 years ago that said, IT as we know it is dead.
Mm-hmm.
And I kind of laid out this whole point. And my message really was that ITSM has lost any strategic relevance within the enterprise. That when I talk to executives, nobody's bringing up ITSM. When you and I hold this podcast, we haven't brought up ITSM. I don't think maybe once, except talking about
Mm-hmm.
ServiceNow, right? That it just has lost the strategic relevance. And what was fascinating about it is it just kicked off this firestorm. It's had 12,000 views. It had about a whole bunch of reposts and 10 comments. But what's probably most striking is that they were all the consultants and not even the tool players for the most part, because most of the tool players have realized this and are moving into other adjacent spaces or trying to
Mm-hmm.
focus on other elements, sort of following the ServiceNow playbook. But it was all the training companies, the consultants that were like, no, it's not, you're an idiot. And it was just sort of it was just sort of fascinating. But going back to your statement that it's about changing and keeping up with what's new and relevant or dying, that so much of the space is just clearly dying. It's just not keeping pace, not recognizing that the world and the nature of how we execute the function of IT is changing. And I think the last little piece, and then I'll be quiet about this, was I did a follow-up post on my Substack for the DX report that talked about the fact that this is really more than just about ITSM. It's really about frameworks. I think DevOps is on the same path. I think any framework in the world of IT just runs this risk of becoming this dogmatic set of principles that people lose sight of the outcomes we're trying to deliver with them and get focused on the framework itself, and that just gets us all screwed up. So going all the way back to what you're saying about Tableau, I think BI has sort of also had historically fallen into that trap. And
Mm-hmm.
I think what is interesting is AI has sort of been this lifeline, in my opinion, because it is so elevated the prominence and importance of data provenance, of all the the entire data lifecycle, all of it, that suddenly it's getting a lot of eyes on it, and it's forcing people to realize that they need to put this new attention on it. So I'm hoping something similar happens with ITSM, but I guess we'll have to see how that one plays out.
Yeah, I find ITSM interesting in that, of course, we've had these rules-based top-down governance frameworks for such a long time for service management that are starting to fall apart under their own weight. But at the same time, the actual automation of IT service orders has never been more important to
Exactly.
make IT work quickly and efficiently. We're increasingly dependent on intelligent IT service management in the general term, the actual dictionary definitions of those words. But the tools that we have right now just don't follow suit very well because they're not flexible enough to actually manage the service orders in a way, or to automate them, or to provide the level of configuration that we're looking for that actually makes IT run quickly. We end up needing intermediaries that are able to actually manage cloud resources or to handle containerization, handle all the virtual machines, all the infrastructure challenges that currently exist, as well as the related governance and security and configuration issues that are out there. It's just that ITSM hasn't been able to keep up. I don't think it's that we don't need ITSM. It's just that the ITSM tools and triggers and that we have in place just don't feel like they are up to the task.
Well, and that was some of the commentary that I got, is that, whether it exists or not, we have to do these functions. And of course that's true, right? And that was sort of my ending point, was that I'm lamenting it because this is a critical function, right? The ability to execute the IT function is absolutely essential to the enterprise, and it is dependent on your ability to operate efficiently and effectively. My point really is that it's not about this dogmatic arguments and debates over what does this term mean or that term mean. It's about how do we actually deconstruct the executional processes that we need to run, and then deliver them and automate them as quickly as possible. And what you tend to find when I talk to enterprise IT leaders that are doing this well, it's like they understand the broad-based principles, and then they sort of ignore the frameworks,
Right.
in terms of, from a dogmatic standpoint, because it ends up distracting them, right? They focus on delivering, what they need to deliver. So I think it's an interesting time. I'm largely encouraged by the tool landscape, the vendor landscape, as far as I think the vendors understand this and are moving in the right directions. I think it's frankly a lot of the IT adherents, the folks that have to sort of figure this out. So we'll see where that plays out. But it also leads to, I think, some of the other announcements and conversations that, or news, I guess, out there, because one of the areas, and I'm gonna give a minor plug here. So one of my clients that I'm working with is a company called Symphony AI, and they in part play in the IT service management space. But one of the things that they announced at this conference while I was there was their own Copilot. And I think one of the things that's interesting is it's based on the Azure OpenAI underlying platform, but they built it purpose built for IT management. So they've infused a whole bunch of data into it. And I think it's a signal of, I think, where this is going, right? I'm fairly, I'll call it middle of the road on the Microsoft Copilot versions of it, because they're so generic and they're so
Right.
productivity based, and it's so hard to drive justification. We've talked about this in the past. But I think what we're seeing, and Amazon officially, they'd announced it before, right? Amazon Q, but they officially released it. Is that what this is? And I think it's a clear signal of their direction of where I think this is all going, that assistants, chatbots, copilots, whatever you want to call them, are only going to be valuable as we infuse business data into them so they can actually be contextually relevant. And so that way I thought was an interesting and positive sign.
Yeah, there's definitely a race right now to get out the generative AI assistants as well as the best models ever. We are either bringing up a model or an assistant practically every week, and I think it's important to discuss not just to keep up with the Joneses, but because every large technology company is trying to show their reference technology standard that they expect as a starting point for either generative AI or the outputs associated with generative AI. And it's important to know what those standards are. What is the actual starting point that you're working with? What are the APIs that you're able to have? What are you able to do from an application development perspective with all of this stuff? And if you don't keep track of what is coming out, you don't even know where to start with this. And it's easy to say, well, none of this works or all of this sounds the same because you haven't kept up. But last week, both Amazon and Anthropic came out with these business focused assistants saying we are ready to handle generative AI challenges for the business world. And not such a surprise for Amazon, but with Anthropic, I think it definitely shows that all of these AI nonprofits that we're talking about doing AI for the good of humanity aren't necessarily focused on just that anymore. At this point, they've all taken billions of dollars. And as I've said a bunch of times, from a VC funding perspective, the easy way to think about funding is that when you take funding, that is now basically your new annual revenue commitment. If you take $1 billion, you're committing to be $1 billion revenue company. And that means changing your organization to fit that new goal and doing whatever it takes.
I was super excited when OpenAI was first founded with this idea that tech companies were contributing in this open, but that ship sailed a long time ago, and I think that frankly it's just marketing or PR blather at this point. I mean, these companies are all straight tech companies, and there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, I think overall it's a good model, it's a good process, having a profit motive, and the investments are so huge. I don't know how there wouldn't be. So the only way, the original idea behind OpenAI was this idea that you contribute and that everyone benefits from the technology, and we have the sort of, had that actually survived, I think that could have worked and could have been cool. But the minute it failed, we were off to the races, and
Yep.
and I think it is what it is. What I will say, I look at these two announcements between the Amazon Q, and the Anthropic, the Claude one, and to me they're wildly different approaches, and speak volumes of where this is going. The Anthropic play, at least as far as I can tell, is mostly, well, first of all, I think it's just an iPhone app. And secondly, it's really just the same sort of approach that, going after what Microsoft or OpenAI is doing, which is pretty generic, productivity driven chat,
Hmm.
a little bit of pieces, but it's really just an enterprise license of the same thing that we all use every day if we're on those platforms. Amazon Q, I thought, was different. I mean, there were really three parts to it. The Amazon Q first was a coding assistant, which basically competes with GitHub. That one, I'm like, yeah, okay, there's plenty of those out there. That one was just sort of an also ran. The second part of that same, because it was really two big buckets. The second part of that was, though, that their bot is trained on optimizing AWS. That I think is
Hmm.
incredibly. I mean, it's on the one hand so self-serving, but I think it's going to be an incredibly useful tool, because so much of the challenges people have working with AWS or Azure or any of them is the ability to optimize those deployments and being able to do that. And so it has this deep awareness of how AWS configurations happen and being able to optimize that. So I think that could be super, super beneficial. And again, this idea of very pragmatic application of it. And then the second is they claim that they have the most connectors to enterprise business apps. And I listed, the who's who of enterprise apps in their
Hmm.
listing of it. And again, what I think is essential is that we are reaching this point where, where we're going to reach this point where there's a shakeout. You don't want to have an entire host of Copilot's assistants. You want to have one. You want to have the ability, or at least in general terms, be able to go and say, ask it whatever, and get this information. So I feel like this was a very direct, um, deliberate approach to how to create a generative AI assistant that is genuinely useful in the enterprise, that provides that sort of contextual layer that I think most others haven't. And it's not lost on me that of course Amazon has made a massive investment in Anthropic, and so you have these two,
Hmm.
companies that are joined at the hip and yet wildly divergent approaches to the enterprise.
Yeah, with Amazon, I agree that the second part that you brought up around Amazon to optimize Amazon environments is very interesting. I feel like Amazon has put a lot of effort into pushing out tools associated with configuration and cost to help users to optimize their environments. And I find it interesting that Amazon is basically saying, if you're trying to optimize your Amazon environment, you can just trust us. We will give you the tools you need to make Amazon better. You know, trust us. We're not like the other foxes that go in the hen house. Like, we are the trusted fox, because we do everything else for you, and we're so good at it anyways. Um, so, but I think that, despite that, it's always a little difficult to say, okay, vendor, you're going to tell me how to optimize vendor selections as the vendor. um, and so I'll be interested to see whether this leads to some Me Too offerings from third parties, or some sort of, or kind of a niche third party uh, kind of set of products that also do the same type of thing, but saying, but we're not Amazon, and we will help clean up your Amazon environment and your Microsoft environment and your Google environment.
Oh, yeah, so I do think that that is right, but I also think it's going to probably kick off a wave of organizations trying to create AI assistants to do this exact thing. Think of how
Mhm.
much time the average enterprise spends in configuring and deploying, a piece of technology, and how having an assistant that actually understands how to do that could be super useful. I think that's actually a real threat to the traditional SIs in all of this, because as we start training assistants, because the big challenge with a lot of the applications that we think about with Gen AI is that there's all these variables and all of these unknowns. Well, with these are actually fairly capped environments. We have a known set of data of exactly what the platform looks like and how it operates, and what this is designed for an algorithm. And so I think it could kick off this whole rash of using tools to configure tools. And there's a few companies that are doing this. Amelia is a conversational AI bot. They've been doing this for a while. They call it Amelia for Amelia, I think. There's others that are going down that road. But you bring up an interesting point, and I think we can wrap up our show talking about this whole challenge of trust. And I think there's a couple of layers to that. The first is there is an article from Fast Company talking about the coming generative AI winter. And if you're new to following AI closely, we've had several AI winters. We've had, going all the way back to, I think, the 1950s, when the first conceptualization of all this, where we have this huge rush of innovation and breakthroughs. And then everyone gets so excited, and then it stalls. And we've gone through this in the broad category of AI probably 3 times, I think, where it's like we have these moments where it's like everything is about to break. And so this article in Fast Company is basically talking about how we're reaching a similar point with generative AI, that there's been all this excitement, all this rush. We talked about just a few weeks ago the escaping his name, but the Meta head of Meta's AI program, talking about how some of these very challenges around generative AI and LLMs. And I think it's I wanted to bring this article up because I think it's a useful reminder that we need to be careful not to fall for all the hype. I wrote an article about the last one we talked about, don't fall for sexy, right? It's like, it is easy to get swept up in all of this. And yet the truth of it is there's more that we don't know than we do know. There's an absolute limit to this technology. We will find it, and it will be then another breakthrough that's necessary to take us to the next level. And maybe this isn't another 20-year winter, but we're going to hit some limits. And I think it's prudent to just be cautious as you are looking at all of this.
Yeah, I feel like with generative AI, at least from a text perspective, what we've really invented is a computer that finally understands grammar, grammar and semantics, which, that the fact that words have other meanings other than their pure definition, that they have feelings associated with them and stuff like that, some semantic and semiotic issues. So, that's great. Computers finally figured out that there are meanings to words that are more sensitive and more interesting. They figured out how to get through a high school English class without being completely overwhelmed, which is something. It's a significant achievement. It really is. And it's allowed us to use language in more nuanced ways in interacting with computers, but it's important to not mistake that for completely fundamentally changing what computers are or what we're trying to do with computers. Like our actual goals in working with computers haven't changed. We are still trying to do tech-enabled processes. We're still trying to get work done. We still have to sell stuff. We still have to make stuff. We still have to do stuff. We still have to run projects. All of that stuff has not changed just because we can now ask our computers slightly more easily what it's trying to do. And also, those generative AI models have their own contextual issues. They're only as good as the data that you've put in, which means their knowledge of history tends to end at a certain point, or their contextual understanding of any topic tends to end at a certain point. And all of that needs to be retuned and re-augmented over time for these models to work. Really, models are just another type of app from that perspective. Apps can get outdated. We can have all sort of technical debt associated with models, just like we do with our apps.
What I do think is interesting about this, so if you look at the past sort of versions of this, what would happen is there's all this sort of excitement in the press or whatever, and then it would fade, the hype would die off, and then what we were left with was like this next layer of embedding. And we saw that with machine learning models until this last hype, right, which were starting to really have an impact. And we started, we had these conversational AI systems. We had these these machine learning algorithms that were powering things like AI ops, right? And so there was a sort of stasis. What I think is different about, and this is why I will say I take this article with a grain of salt. I think there's no question we're overhyped. There's no question people like Sam Altman are going out there and talking about this stuff like it's going to completely transform the world. And I don't really buy that. I think we are going to see a fall off on the hype, that we're going to start hitting some limits. What I do think is interesting, though, is that the big thing that's happened in this case is that it has now entered the public consciousness, where we now have the little Meta click to go and access the Llama 3 model directly from Facebook and Instagram. We have this embedded into all the Microsoft Office suites, which means everybody's using this, right? And we're seeing this embed everywhere. Snapchat has it right now. So suddenly these AI bots are everywhere, and I think that's going to kind of create this new foundational layer. I going back to the article or the post on LinkedIn about ICT service management being dead. One of the things that I talked about is the fact that I actually do think co-pilots and this whole idea of this true conversational interface is going to be transformative in the way we execute many functions, including, say, ITSM. And so I do think we're going to, I still think it's going to be this winter. I think that's all true. But I think what we're going to find is this new baseline is in fact higher. It's not going to fade away and go away. It's just we're going to see the things like what you talked about at Tableau, what we talked about at Zendesk a couple of weeks ago, where it just gets normalized, becomes this new baseline of how we function and operate, but the hype is going to fade off. And so I think that the trick as an enterprise leader is to figure out what that balance point is and make your investments accordingly. Don't do what Moderna did, right? A couple of what we talked about a week or two ago, right? Where you're like, oh, this is going to do everything. We're going to redo every single function around it. But look at how you make these strategic bets of where it actually makes sense.
Yes. And also, I feel that honestly, this is still early days for generative AI. We are still starting to see we're just starting to see new model approaches, like the mixture of experts models that we've seen Databricks and Snowflake come out with recently, where they're saying, yeah, we're going to build this large model, but you're only going to access maybe 10% of it at any given time and access these specific experts. We might start seeing something that abstracts LLMs, where you ask something and it finds the right LLM for you for the right task, because we're going to start seeing LLMs that are very specifically focused on specific areas. But we haven't done this yet. Right now, we're, for the most part, just kind of throwing everything into these dense LLMs or these large models and just hoping that something nice comes out, or trying to augment these really large models with a little bit of extra data and hoping that provides enough context. Like, these are baby steps. This is embryonic in terms of what this is going to look like in 5 years. We haven't really even figured out how to use this technology right yet. So yes, there's going to be this decline as we realize this initial approach that we're taking has its limits, but I feel like we've just barely scratched the surface on how to actually use this technology correctly.
Yeah, I mean, we talked about it. This article talks about agentic AI. I've been talking about that a lot, and that is really, honestly, just this idea of being able to do exactly what you talked about, whether that's mixture of experts or using APIs to connect to other authoritative data sources, using RAG, all these different approaches. And that could be the interesting thing. Maybe we don't hit a winter. Maybe we have hit that tipping point because this leads to, and then by the time we see other advancements in other forms of technology, we can now use the LLM as a front end to connect to it. So maybe, I think, but I think it is at least a valid point of caution to be thinking about where are these limits and how do you not get swept up in all of it, and just applying some good old fashioned critical thought to it.
And on that note, I think we're going to wrap this up. There's been a lot to think about in generative AI. Are we headed for a generative AI winter? Kind of. That, I think, kind of, yes, but it doesn't mean the end of generative AI as we know it. So with that, thanks for joining us today, and thanks for listening to us. Hope this gives you some ideas for how to work with your IT departments and how to think about some strategic investments going forward. And as always, like, subscribe, comment. If you have any other topics you want us to look at, just let us know. And thanks for joining us today.